Hey guys, Heidi Preeb here. Welcome back to my channel. This week we are talking about the different insecure attachment styles. So avoidant, anxious, and fearful avoidant. We might not get to fearful avoidant this week, but we will get there. And why they fear intimacy. So there is kind of this trope in attachment communities that people who use avoidant attachment strategies have a fear of intimacy, but those who use an anxious attachment strategy love intimacy, that they are intimacy junkies, that they can't get enough of it. And I absolutely agree that this is true on a conscious level. Okay, so people using anxious attachment strategies tend to tell you outright that they really want and crave and thrive on emotional intimacy and intensity, right? And that they want to get more and more of that, and even that it can feel like a bit of a hit for them. Like it can feel like kind of a drug to get to know someone on a really deep level really fast. But knowing someone deeply and quickly and intensely is not the same thing as emotional intimacy. Okay, and we're going to talk in this video about what true emotional intimacy is and why the anxious style, like the avoidant style, actually has a fear of true adult emotional intimacy. Okay, I'm trying to think of a good metaphor for this. Marianne Williamson has this book on weight loss where she talks about people who compulsively eat tend to think that they really love and enjoy food. But she makes the point that if you really love and enjoy food, what that means is that you savor your food. You put a lot of intentional care into everything you eat, and as you're eating it, you're really present with your food, and you really pay attention to how you feel in your body as a response to it. Versus compulsive overeaters are more likely to actually kind of zone out when they eat. They might want to always have the TV on when they're eating. They might eat while they're doing other things. They're probably less likely to be truly savoring and experiencing their food in a very present way when they're eating. And this is kind of the same thing with people who consider themselves to be intimacy or emotional junkies, right? If you always want that hit, always want that intensity, always want to go right to the core, you hate small talk, you can't stand anything other than the most intense personal conversations with people, you are not fostering and savoring a sense of emotional intimacy. You're actually rushing right past emotional intimacy and going straight to enmeshment, right? Enmeshment is when you're kind of merging with someone else. It's where there's very little differentiation between you two, so you can't actually properly see where one person ends and the other begins, because it's this desire to kind of share the human experience so intensely that there is no space between you. That is not intimacy. Intimacy is when you're able to draw your boundaries clearly enough that you can properly see each other. Because if you have no dividing lines between you and someone else, you aren't actually able to observe where you end and they begin. And observing where you end and someone else begins is the birthplace of intimacy, because you're able to actually understand what things are like for them in a way that is separate from what it's like for you. And that is what it means to see someone else. When you're feeling desperate to get to that intensity, the heart of things, you're probably looking to kind of lose yourself a little bit in someone else. And when you are lost in someone else, you are not giving yourself a proper vantage point to see them from. It's like you're blacking out while eating or using a substance. Both of which, by the way, I'm not judging. I've very much been there for many years of my life in all of these areas. And that's how I know that when we are doing these things, we are not savoring or appreciating what we're doing. We are using these things to forget ourselves. Now, this is layer one for the anxious attachment style of why they fear emotional intimacy. Because if they had true emotional intimacy, it would actually require them to take a step back. It would require them to show up as themselves, put boundaries around themselves, let the other person have boundaries, and share across those boundaries. And that is scary for someone with an anxious attachment style, because they tend to instinctually perceive boundaries to be barriers to getting to know someone, rather than healthy limits that are put in place so that both people can appreciate one another fully. So the most conscious reason why someone with an anxious attachment strategy might be fearful of intimacy is because intimacy requires boundaries. Boundaries feel threatening for an anxious attachment style. Here's why. Many people with anxious attachment strategies in play will not realize that this is what they're doing, okay? But there is an unconscious need or belief that someday someone will come around, be able to cater and respond appropriately to all of their needs, and when that happens, they will finally feel happy and fulfilled, and like all of their problems will be gone. It is that savior fantasy, right? And again, sometimes that's conscious for them. Most of the time it's not. It's operating under the surface. But there is usually, with people using anxious attachment strategies, that sense of someday someone's going to come along and be the answer to all of my emotional pain. And this is why very often you see anxiously attached people chasing avoidant people, because if an anxious person were to chase, let's say, another anxious person or a secure person, both of those people would come into the equation with their own needs and vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And for someone using an anxious attachment strategy, they unconsciously don't want to have to deal with anyone else's needs or feelings or experiences that are vulnerable and difficult, because it means that that person is suddenly not available to deal with their needs and challenges and problems. Unconsciously, people using an anxious attachment strategy are kind of seeking out a parent figure, and they would not tell you this, they might not even admit it to themselves, but their dream, when they're picturing that perfect relationship, they're usually picturing a relationship where the person they're with either has no vulnerabilities and attends to theirs full time, or who has very specific vulnerabilities that the anxiously attached person is imagining they will help them bust through and get over in this kind of romantic fantasy. But that fantasy does not leave room for true unsexy vulnerabilities and problems and emotional dysregulation that eventually any partner of any attachment style will end up showing up with. So the reason why anxiously attached people tend to chase avoidantly attached people is because on the surface, avoidantly attached people look like they have no needs and no vulnerabilities and nothing to work through on their own, because they do not share the parts of themselves that they struggle with. So for the anxiously attached person who is unconsciously looking for a bit of a parent figure who will put all of their own needs aside and attend to theirs, the avoidantly attached person looks like that person. They look like a person who is so self-regulated and so on top of their emotions that they can now attend to yours full time. But that's not actually what the avoidant attachment style is, because true intimacy between two people is not about one person sharing and the other person endlessly caretaking for them. It's also not about one person savioring the other, which might be part of a fantasy that someone using an anxious strategy might have around how they're going to deal with their partner's insecurities and vulnerabilities. True intimacy is two people supporting one another as they work through their own problems and challenges. And this doesn't mean that they never help each other. It doesn't mean that they aren't there to talk things through and vent about things together. But true intimacy requires two people showing up as their adult selves. And to be your adult self means to be able to self-regulate, to be able to take care of your own difficult or tough emotions when they come up, and to not expect your partner to fix anything for you. And the idea that a partner is not going to be the thing that fixes their emotional challenges is unconsciously very threatening for the anxiously attached style, because they feel perpetually like they have a little bit of an open wound that they don't know how to heal on their own. And this is where all of those fantasies about a savior, about a partner who is going to help them feel better once and for all for good, come into play. They feel like they don't know how to patch up that wound. But true intimacy requires two people who are responsible for patching up their own wounds and healing their own pain and their own trauma, and simply supporting each other in the process in a parallel way, right? Like you're moving side by side, giving support to each other, rather than staring directly into each other's eyes and looking at each other as the solution to those problems. But that wounded inner child that lives inside of someone who uses an anxious attachment strategy doesn't want to do that. They don't feel capable of taking responsibility for their own healing because they feel inside like kind of a scared little kid, right? So true emotional intimacy, which is taking responsibility for your own feelings, your own healing, your own direction in life, and also being there to support someone else as they take responsibility for their own lives, is threatening to that inner child inside of the anxiously attached person who feels like they're still kind of waiting for the person to show up and show them how to navigate the world, right? And it isn't baked into their fantasy that true emotional intimacy, someone truly showing up to help them in that way, would be someone who encourages them to stand on their own 2 feet rather than relying on them for support. So that's layer 2. Okay. Layer 3 of fearing emotional intimacy for the anxiously attached person is kind of baked into layer 2, but it's the fact that if they were emotionally intimate with someone else, they would have to, at some point, acknowledge their own flaws, shortcomings, and things they struggle with that are not necessarily nice, good, or innocent. Now, again, the anxious attachment strategy involves having a wounded inner child, and that wounded inner child feels perpetually as though they are owed care, and attention from someone else. Now, the reason the child feels that way is because they didn't get the consistent warmth and affection and validation and encouragement that they truly did need and deserve as a child. And so people using an anxious strategy tend to grow up almost feeling in some way like they have that kind of purity that a child has, where they don't yet know that they can make mistakes, they can hurt people, they can do things wrong. And it can actually be incredibly difficult for those using an anxious attachment strategy to take responsibility for the ways in which they are hurting other people, the ways in which they are expecting their partners to do things for them that their partner is not comfortable doing, the ways that even though they're showing up with good intent in many cases, they might be accidentally hurting someone else by not properly considering the other person's true point of view. Okay? Because with the anxious attachment strategy, there is this inherent sense of I am innocent that is at the core of their worldview. And it lives in that kind of childlike sense of them that they never properly were able to grow up because they didn't have the guidance they needed to grow it up properly. So now as adults, when you have an anxious element to your attachment style, it can actually be incredibly threatening to your ego to see yourself as doing something wrong or as hurting someone else. Because in your mind, as long as your intentions are good, no one could possibly get hurt. However, that is absolutely not how things work in the real world, right? So true emotional intimacy between two adult partners requires both people taking responsibility for the ways in which they hurt each other, for the mistakes that they make, and also for the parts of their personality that aren't particularly glamorous. So for the anxious attachment strategy, part of which involves a view of the self as endlessly good and as the kind of person who would never do something to hurt another person, it's that exact part of the ego that has to be put down in order for true emotional intimacy to form. But that can be very threatening for people using an anxious attachment strategy because their entire view of self is oriented around that view of the self as a good and caring and giving and only loving person. And if your ego is oriented around that, it's very difficult to recognize when you have made a mistake, when you have hurt someone else, when you have projected your own need onto someone else in a situation where actually it's your responsibility to self-regulate and to take responsibility for the way that you feel and the way that you're showing up in the world. And so the kind of deepest level of why emotional intimacy can be scary for those using an anxious attachment strategy is because it requires you to see yourself clearly, both for better and for worse, and to be able to communicate without a crushing amount of shame, which is what you might feel when you start to try to communicate this, the ways in which you are not perfect. You are not perfectly loving. You are not perfectly selfless. And the good news is absolutely nobody is, right? So it's probably not as shameful as you might feel in your bones that it is to admit those things. But again, from the get-go, it can be really difficult to access the part of the self that can see the self clearly, acknowledge the impact that even your good intentions can have on someone else in a negative way, own up to those things, and talk about better strategies for fixing those problems. So again, intimacy requires two people in their adult selves taking responsibility for their own emotions. And yes, absolutely supporting each other, getting to know each other, sharing in each other's highs and lows in life, but ultimately always returning to the self as the main source of security, right? And that is a scary thought for the anxiously attached person who doesn't have a strong internal secure base that they can turn to when times get rough. Again, it's having that locus of control or that center of gravity outside of the self and really fearing a situation in which you have to turn inward to get the resources you need. But without the ability to do that, it's really hard to have any true source of emotional intimacy because you're not being interdependent if you're looking towards each other to get all of your needs met. That's codependence, and it's not emotional intimacy. It's emotional addiction to co-regulating through someone else. So the route to healing for the anxiously attached individual is always going to be the process of fostering that secure base within yourself so that you can approach relationships at a lower intensity level, right? Intimacy requires the ability to savor and appreciate and be present with another person without needing for it to be so intense and so much volume, right? And in order to move at a comfortable and non-panicked pace towards intimacy, you have to have the ability to self-regulate when someone, let's say, isn't texting you back as quickly as you would like. You have to have the ability to shift perspective, understand that other people have different needs and desires and wants than you do, and you have to be able to accommodate those things without losing your sense of self-worth in the process. And until you can do that, it's going to be really difficult to have true interdependent intimacy between adults. right? So we will talk much more in future videos about the attachment healing process. And I want to note that none of this is about shaming or saying that you're wrong for the way you process as an insecurely attached person. It's just about being aware of what your patterning is so that you can take a more direct approach to fixing that patterning and showing up in the world in a way that makes you feel a lot more secure in yourself, which is the ultimate goal for anyone with an insecure attachment strategy. Right? All right, that's all that I have to say for today on the anxious attachment style and their fear of intimacy. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are, what's coming up for you as you go through these videos. As always, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again really soon.